Mythicists often claim that they're not taken seriously, and there's a variety of reasons for this. One of those reasons is because they often introduce or even give a platform to ideas that are just conspiracy theories or that should not be promoted. Now, often it seems as if they're so eager to welcome these new ideas into the crowd that they don't actually really fact check them. And this becomes a huge problem because often these novel ideas are just bogus. Because of this, what happens is that all mythicists kind of get lumped together because they kind of prop each other up. So if you're propping up bad ideas, you're going to be lumped in with them, and eventually you're not going to be taken seriously. Now, here enters Godless Engineer and the authors of the book Christ Before Jesus. This book, Christ Before Jesus, written by Jaaron, Wingo, and Britt, is possibly one of the worst books on the topic of Jesus mythicism that has been published recently. And the big problem here is that so many people who are mythicist or mythicist adjacent decide to give these individuals a platform to further their view. What this leads to is a very real reason to not take mythicism seriously. If we have such bad views that are being propped up, why should we take anything that they say seriously at all? Obviously, they don't know fact from fiction, good research from bad research. Now, that really isn't a fair thing to say, but that is what happens within this scholarship, within this realm. Now, honestly, I think a lot of this bad scholarship, a lot of these bad ideas need to be squashed. They need to be shown for what they are. Just utter nonsense. So this is why we'll be looking at the interview by Godless Engineer with the authors of Christ Before Jesus. Now, if you don't know the work Christ Before Jesus, their main selling point is that they're using styometry in order to prove that not only did Jesus and Paul not exist, but the entire New Testament was written in the 2nd century. So let's let the authors explain what they think styometry is.
It's a literary analysis that's been around since the 1800s. It's using math. It's not AI. It's not machine learning. It's not that kind of stuff.
Styometry is a form of literary analysis. It's a way to actually study the literary styles of a variety of different things. Most often, it's used to determine who the author is, or even sometimes if a work is actually a forgery. Now, styometry has been around for a long time. The first writings that we have about it are from the 1800s. But it's not until the 1960s that we really get this computational styometry. And since then, we've had a lot of different studies that have used styometry in order to try to help us understand the New Testament better, and specifically who wrote the Pauline epistles. But one thing that we really have to focus on here is this idea that styometry is not machine learning. But often, and we'll see this actually in this interview, that a lot of the things that they describe actually deal with machine learning. Now, it is true that Wingo and Britt do not use this machine learning type of styometry, which is called a supervised study, and they instead use an unsupervised study. But a lot of the evidence that they're using in order to prop up their claims is actually based on this machine learning style. So this is something that we have to keep in mind because it will become relevant later on. So let's step back just for a moment though and let them explain a little bit more what styometry is or what it can actually accomplish.
Is if you write a text and I write a text, styometry would be able to tell us that that's two separate authors.
So this is a basic idea, but it's not really that easy. In fact, when we look at styometry, we're often looking at just one tool in a much larger bag. Now, what styometry can do is it can point us in a certain direction, but we still have to validate that analysis. We have to use other means in order to really bump up that argument. There's also a lot of different factors that come into play here. Styometry isn't simply adding stuff to a program and hoping that it spits out the right information, because often it won't do that. There are so many variables that go into this that can actually provide false readings. So while styometry in a basic idea will point to different authors, we have to understand that it's not actually that simple, that it's just one tool and there's so many things that can go wrong. Now, some may be questioning who have never really heard of styometry whether or not it is actually a legitimate type of tool. And the answer is yes. We actually have some really good examples of how it kind of works or how it has worked in the past. And we have a lot of studies that actually go into it. But let's let Wingo actually talk about one of those examples.
Kind of cool examples here recently with J.K. Rowling. J.K. Rowling wrote under a pseudonym, Robert Galbraith, and readers were able to find that Robert Galbraith was actually J.K. Rowling.
So this is a very interesting example because it actually showed that J.K. Rowling was writing under another name. But we have to actually dive more into this. Now, the great thing about this is that the person who actually ran this study actually wrote an article for Scientific American. Now, the person who did it, his name is Patrick Jula, and he's been working in Styometry for a very long time. The nice thing about his article is that he really breaks down what happened. Now, the big thing here is that it wasn't actually Styometry that got this idea out first, that J.K. Rowling was writing under a different name. Instead, what happened is that someone got a tip about this, and then he was contacted about whether or not we could verify that tip. And the reason he was contacted is because he's known for doing these styometric analysis. So what did he actually do? Well, he ran a supervised styometric analysis, meaning that he actually used machine learning here. So the way that this actually worked is that he actually had a variety of different corpuses that had various authors in them. One of the authors that he used was J.K. Rowling. Now, what he actually did is he ran the book A Cuckoo's Calling against these other authors. So what we have here is really kind of a machine learning type of analysis, because what we're doing, or what he was doing, was actually taking these authors and making the program learn how they wrote. And by doing that, he could run this other work against these known authors. So it's not really what Wingo and Britt are doing here at all. It's a very different situation. Now, if you actually read the article in Scientific American, Jula tells you that this only got him so far, that there had to be other things that they used in order to really confirm this. And in the end, it wasn't a slam dunk. It was more pointing towards something that was most likely the case, but they couldn't fully confirm. What ended confirming this is when a reporter contacted J.K. Rowling and they said, hey, we have a tip, we have some evidence that points to this, and it really forced her to come clean. So if we actually looked at this case, it wasn't a definite pointing to this is the author of this work. Instead, it was a suggestion that this was the author, and they had to later confirm it by other means. So in the case with J.K. Rowling, it was something that more pointed to what the most likely possibility was. But we have another example here. Let's let Wingo again explain it.
Trump in specific, he tweets so much that we're able to use stalometry to determine if it's him tweeting or if it's possibly a staff.
So again, we're looking more at a machine learning, a supervised type of study here, in which the program is being fed information to help it learn the style of an individual, and from there, other texts are being compared to what we know is true. And that can kind of help us determine whether or not this new text is most likely from the same author or for someone else. It doesn't give us a definite answer, but it tells us whether or not it seems like it could be from that same individual. Again, this is not the type of study that Wingo and Britt are doing. So it really has no relevance to what they're saying, because they're not doing a supervised study, they're doing an unsupervised study. And this is really a key point. You can't cite information for a different type of study in order to support your own study if they're not similar. This is something that they do time and time again. They apply studies that have nothing to do with what they're specifically doing and claiming that it actually supports their idea. So this is something that we'll keep our eye on. Okay, so now that we have kind of a basic idea of what styometry does, how does it work? Well, let's let Britt kind of explain.
This is looking at the most frequent words that we use. And across most languages, those are going to be your function words and articles, things like.
So yes, when we're looking at styometric analysis, one of the things that we look at are most frequent words. So the words that we use most often, and often those will be pronouns or will be articles. But there's a variety of other things that we also look at. So when we go back to that study with J.K. Rowling, it wasn't just most frequent words that were being looked at. It was also phrases. There was also engrams, which were looking at just different letters that were appearing beside each other. There was sentence length. There was a variety of different things that dealt with style that were actually being looked at. And if you look at that study by Jula, what happens is he actually looks at all these different factors, and that's how he comes to his conclusion. It's not just most frequent words, but that is something that we do look at. So yes, we do look at most frequent words when we're looking at styometric analysis, but that's not all that we look at. There's another issue here, though, because when we look at New Testament texts, the most common words aren't always just those function words that they're claiming. And in fact, in their book, they actually claim that religious terms never become the most frequent words, that just doesn't happen, that they're far down on the list. But we actually know that's not true. So when you're learning Greek, one of the best things that you can get if you're trying to learn Greek is this book right here by Bruce Metzger. It's Lexical Aids for Students of New Testament Greek. It breaks down the amount of times that a word is used. So if you look at it, you really see the frequency of the word. So you'll have like words that are used 500 times, words that are used 400 times, 100 times. And what this allows you to do is focus on the words that are used the most throughout these texts. That way, once you actually learn these words, you have a lot better understanding of what's going on. And from there, you can kind of add different words to your references. Now, when we look at the most frequent words within New Testament texts, what we see is that it's not just pronouns, it's not just articles. In fact, we see a variety of words that are very religious in terms. So when we look at this book, the most frequent words that they have are 500 or more. And if you actually look at the articles that I wrote on this, I really kind of delve more into this and tell you exactly how many times these words are used. But if we just look at this for right now, what we see are words like anthropos, which is man, or we see theos, which is God. So, and those are just the words that are over 500 times. Now, if we look at words that are just down the row, we see a lot of other things like adelphos, which is brother, and that is a religious term here because often it's meant in a religious manner. We can also look at the word hagios, which is the term holy. We have other words like andros, which is man, and then we have words like logos, which is a very religious word. So when we're looking at the New Testament, it's not like other texts. We're seeing a lot of religious discussion. And this is kind of a key point because if you look at their book, they'll tell you that religion has no factor in any of this. Theme has no factor. And they say that, well, religious terms don't actually ever occur in the most frequent words, but they obviously do. They're some of the most frequent words within the New Testament. So this is just another thing to be aware of because when they're actually talking about how this is done, it's quite clear that they don't fully understand what they're talking about. So now we understand some of the basics, but how accurate is styometry? Well, it's going to depend on who you listen to. Well, let's look at what Britt has to say.
The way we do it, we think that we have over 96% accuracy when it comes to Greek.
Now, the problem here is that they don't explain how they got to that rationing. How did they actually find out that their readings were actually 96% accurate? And what exactly does that mean? Now, if you look at the literature on this subject, what you find is that it's going to depend on what you're actually looking at. Now, one of the ways that you're going to get more accuracy is if you're using a supervised study, because what you're going to do there is you're going to be looking at information that is by one author, and then you're going to be looking at another work that we don't know what the author is, but we're going to compare it to someone that we know. And by doing that, we can generally be pretty accurate on whether or not they're the same authors, because we actually have a defined style. Now, if you don't have a defined style, the accuracy is probably going to go down simply because you have more variables that go into this. Now, I can't really critique what their accuracy rate is because they don't show how they got that, how they confirmed that their accuracy is that high. But what I can tell you is that if you read through the literature, you have a lot of reason to doubt that they're actually being truthful, or even if they're being truthful, whether or not what they're doing is accurate, because that doesn't seem to be an accuracy that we see anywhere else. Often it's a lot more variable than that. So now, if they don't actually tell us how they figured out this accuracy, do they at least tell us what their methodology is? Well, no. Let's actually just kind of look at this.
So we first, when we built it out, we did a test kit. We did multiple tests with this test kit, over 100 Greek texts. And once we got a methodology that would actually accurately identify these texts.
So what Britt really tells us is that they have some sort of test kit. They don't tell us what's in it, how they ran it, or anything like that, and that from this they developed a methodology. Now, here's the thing. One of the things I really tried hard when looking through this book was trying to figure out what their methodology was. Now, if you're going to replicate their study, you need to know not only what text they're using, but how they actually ran this. Now, finding stylo was easy enough. Learning how to use stylo was easy enough. But what wasn't easy was trying to figure out how they actually approached this. So what I did is I actually emailed them trying to figure out what their methodology was. And after a few runarounds, they finally told me exactly what they did. And if you're wondering what those emails contain, I also published them. Everything's on my website, thecuriouschristian.org, and you can actually go through all this in a lot more detail than this video is. But basically what their methodology is just running stylo in its default manner. So all that they really change is the distance, the way that you calculate distance. They don't change anything else, they simply run it in its default settings. So when they tell you that they go through all this trouble trying to figure out what the best way to do it, and that they're running these test kits, that they are trying to find out what is most accurate, what it comes down to, what their methodology is simply taking Stylo, downloading it onto their computer, and running it in default. That's it. So if they spent a lot of time figuring this out, I have a lot of doubts about what they're doing. So we already have a number of issues that are kind of arising. We have a flawed idea of what styometry is. We have a flawed idea of how styometry is done. We find out that their methodology really isn't anything spectacular, that it's just running it in a default manner. But we have a bigger problem here, and this may be the biggest point that I want to point out. Their understanding of styometry is truly flawed, and we'll see why in this clip.
I think where we get a bit more novel with our usage of this is that, and what we do is we break it down at the chapter level or a chapter or two, depending on the size of the chapters, which gives you a very different look.
There is a reason why no one runs a styometric analysis at the chapter level. It simply doesn't work. If you read any of the literature on this subject, you would know that you need much larger data sets. So we can actually look at some of the people who developed styometry. Now, one of those, his last name is Eater. I'm not going to even try to pronounce his first name, but he's one of the leads who actually developed this. Now, when he actually looked at how many words you need to run a styometric analysis, came up with a few conclusions. And again, if you want more detail on this, I have everything on my website. I have all the links to all these articles, all that. But basically what Eater tells us is that you need 5,000 words minimum. Now, if you go below 5,000, you can kind of get some readings at 3,000, but below that, you're not really going to get anything that's accurate. Now, that was in an earlier paper. Later on, he did kind of clarify this, and he looked at it once more. And while those numbers did come down a little bit, they didn't really change overall, because what he came up with is that it's going to depend on what you're doing. Yes, sometimes you can get away with a smaller sample size, but often you're going to need at least 5,000 words or more in order to really get an accurate performance here. Now, what he's specifically talking about, though, are supervised studies. So if you actually read the papers that he has on this, he's talking about supervised studies where you have an author and you're comparing another text to the author. Now, in some cases, the style is so thick with that author that you can tell whether or not this other author is probably that person. But there's another caveat here, because often the research that he's doing, the examples that he gives, is running one piece of work against multiple authors. And you can tell that, yeah, this definitely is more alike with this author than this author. But that's not always the case. If you actually read his papers, what he tells you is that, yes, sometimes you can go down to like 1,000 words. But even then, that's not always going to work. More often than not, you're going to need a lot more information than that. And again, I can't stress this enough, he's using a supervised model. So that doesn't really even come into play with what they're doing. But we can actually even extend from this. There's other studies that look at this and tell you that at minimum, you need at least 1,000 most frequent words. So again, you're going to need 3,000 to 5,000 words in general in order to make Eater's delta, that's the distance measure that they're using, actually work correctly. That is basically the sweet spot within Eater's delta is 1,000 most frequent words. So now when we look at all of this at a whole, how many words are they actually running? Well, in their book, they claim that the average word count of a chapter within these New Testament texts is around 400 to 500 words. So at best, they're half what they need to be. They're only half of what they need to be if we look at just a 1,000 word minimum. If we're looking at the actual 5,000 word minimum, then we're looking at 10 times lower than what you need. But there's a bigger problem here. Because even though these chapters might have 500 words, when we actually look at most frequent words, often we're looking at 50, sometimes 20. Very seldom do we actually get even the base minimum that they're running, 100 most frequent words. Instead, what we see is you have 50 words that are used 2 times or more, and the rest of the words are used only once, meaning that the rest of the words in that chapter are unique words. You can't call them the most frequent words. And because of this, you're going to have a massive amount of issues. So if you have 50 words that are unique and you're just kind of running them in a random order, what's going to happen is that you're going to have a lot of false positives with other works because, yeah, those other works might also use that word once, but the fact that they're actually in that section along the most frequent words is completely by random. So it's not really helping an analysis at all. So the big thing here is that the way that they're running their styometric analysis is flawed from the beginning. You cannot get accurate results from running so low of numbers. You cannot get accurate results by running it at the chapter level. There is nothing within the literature that even supposes that you could do that. So what they're doing is they're running a flawed methodology, one that no one else would even consider because it's so bad, and they're coming to conclusions based on that. That is just terrible, terrible research. Now, this is something that they just double down on over and over again, that somehow they've done something that no one else has done. So let's see Wingo just repeat this claim.
And even at the chapter level, we can still find that level of accuracy.
So what evidence does he have for this? Well, he does post some of the information in his book, but if we look at those graphs, I'll actually link one down below that I actually completely go over. What we see is that their arguments simply don't make sense. They don't even make sense as to what's happening in their graphs. So they can claim that they have this accuracy. They can claim that they're doing something that no one else would ever do, that anyone who knows what styometry is, how to run styometric analysis, they would never, ever do it. They can claim all that. But it doesn't mean it's fact. It means that they're just making up stuff here, or that they're so naive, so ignorant as to what styometry is, that they don't know that they're doing something wrong. Either case, this would actually allow us to dismiss most of what they've done, because their methodology, their thinking about all this, is just fundamentally wrong. I think what's even more frustrating, though, is that they try to say that they actually have evidence for this, that they have reasons to believe that their method would work. So let's just look at what Wingo has to say.
The scholars behind the software Stylo that we use have actually come out here within the last about year and a half or so. They've come out and said that the amount of data that you need in order to achieve these accurate results is a lot less than previously thought.
So now here's the thing. I went out of my way to contact these creators, to contact these authors, to try to figure out what their methodology was, how they actually confirmed their methodology. And they wouldn't really give me any resources. What they told me is that, hey, we can't actually tell you what we use. We can't tell you what articles we relied on because they're copywritten. That's just nonsense. Because they could have just sent me a link to the articles. They could have told me what article they used. But they wouldn't do that. And there's a reason for that. Because they don't have actual research to base this off of. Now, I've looked at as much as I could from Eater or any of the people associated with this program. And none of them, not a single one, says that the threshold is 300 to 400 words, that you can run a accurate measurement off of just 500 words, at least not the way that they're doing it. In fact, we do have a 2017 paper by Eater, I've already mentioned this once, where he does actually tell you that, yeah, we can actually bring the threshold down a little bit in certain circumstances, but that's not always going to work. It's going to be these specific circumstances, and that's going to be largely within the supervised studies. So this has no bearing on what the authors of Christ Before Jesus are doing. So no, they don't have evidence that you can use 400 or 500 words. It simply isn't out there. There's nothing in the literature that would tell you that. And even the creators of this program tell you that you need a lot more information than that. That the more information, the better. Here's the thing. I think if you're going to really dive into a new method, if you're going to dive into a new field or anything, you really need to be informed. And from all this, we can see that Britt and Wingo really aren't that informed. Now, we have another clip here that will actually kind of cement this idea.
part of that is also the fact that it was just way harder to do it a few years ago before this software came out.
So the thing is, we've had programs out for a very long time that you could download at home that actually allows you to do styometric analysis right from the comfort of your own home. But that's just from your own home. There's been other ways that you could actually do this. So we have studies going back all the way to the 1960s in which people are using these massive computers, because that's how big computers were at that time, and they're still doing these styometric analysis. Yes, it's not as easy as doing it from your own home, but if you're a researcher, if you're someone who's doing this professionally, it's not that difficult. You have ways to do this. You have the programs that were created specifically for this. Yes, now we can do it from home, but that's also been true for quite some time. Now, I've mentioned Patrick Jula before, and what he actually created was a new program. That is what he used to determine that J.K. Rowling actually wrote this other book. That program is actually available for free. You can download it. It's something that's been out for quite some time. So it's not like we haven't been able to do this. We've had a variety of different means in order to still do this. Yes, maybe it's a little bit easier, but that doesn't change how we actually run this stuff. Now, if they had done their research, they would know all of this backstory. They would know all of this history. They wouldn't make claims saying that, hey, it's only now that we can actually do this, because that's false. But what they're trying to do is basically build up a conspiracy theory. At least that's my view. They're trying to build up this conspiracy theory saying, hey, only now can we actually do this. This is why no one has actually done it before. This is why no one actually would even try it before. We are doing something completely new, and it's because, we have new techniques or something. That's nonsense. Honestly, though, it gets even worse because they're not using a lot of logic here. So let's just see Britt kind of explain this a little bit more.
Somebody who was doing this 10, 20 years ago is probably going to have to go through and count each word by hand and make a graph or like a spreadsheet or something.
Okay, so let's just assume that 10, 20 years ago that they had to do exactly what Britt was saying. Now, that's not true. He would know this if he actually looked at the research. But going chapter by chapter would be so much easier than going by complete books. So why wouldn't they just go chapter by chapter if they had to do everything manually? Because honestly, it would be a lot less work. Now, the reason they didn't do that is because all of the research, all of the data tells us that you need a lot more information in order to make an accurate assumption and an accurate analysis. You can't go chapter by chapter, and that's why we haven't done that. So even the logic here that before you had to do everything manually doesn't make a lot of sense if you just realize that, well, it would have made it a lot easier if we just went chapter by chapter. But they didn't do that because it doesn't work. Okay, so let's take a breath here. Now, what we have really seen is that their methodology is questionable, that their knowledge about styometry is questionable, that their background here is questionable. But one of the things that they really try to promote is this idea, well, let's just let Wingo actually say it.
And not only that, but we explained in our book how anybody else could do it. We literally say, this is where to get the software. It's free. It's open source. We explain how to open it up and install it and run it. Like, we're trying to encourage people to see it for themselves.
So yes, one of the things that they constantly say is that they want their readers to be able to replicate their ideas, that they want them to actually be able to try this themselves and find the information themselves. But again, we already discussed this. They don't tell you what their methodology is. They don't tell you what text they're using. They don't really tell you at all how to run this. So the thing is, if they actually wanted you to be able to replicate this, they would tell you in chapter 7 of their book, where they go over their methodology, what their actual methodology is. But they don't do that. They kind of give you a runaround. And if you ask them, they just give you a larger runaround until you really try to just hammer down the point. Now, this is one of the reasons that I not only think that they're lying, or at least they're being manipulative, but they're really just espousing a conspiracy theory, because they're trying to make it seem as if they want you to find the information yourself. And that's one of the hallmarks of conspiracy theories. But in fact, they don't actually want you to find the information yourselves, which is why they try to hide it as well. And often, again, you see this in conspiracy theories all the time. And all of this just makes me very leery of what they have to say, because if they were being honest, if they were being truthful, they would give you the tools in order to actually replicate what they are doing, because that is what they claim they want you to do. But they don't do that. They hide their methodology, which is very questionable to say the least. So now we've really gone over the methodology, and that's all behind us. So what can we actually do with styometry? I think that's probably the big question. What are they doing with styometry? Now, one of the first things that they point out is that, well, we've done this with Paul. Well, let Britt actually tell you.
First off, we can talk about Paul. Scholars have known for a long time that, especially the pastoral epistles, which are First Timothy, Second Timothy, and Titus, were not written by the same person that wrote the rest, and there are only 7 that they generally attribute to this Paul figure.
So yes, we actually have a very long history of using styometry with the Pauline epistles, and this is really how we know that some are most likely forgeries. Now, we haven't always done this with computers. We've done more non-mathematical styles of styometry on this, and what we see by looking at the styles, by looking at the word choice, by looking at the themes and all of that, is that some of these texts don't seem to really fit in with what we know about Paul. Now, over time, we have done a variety of tests using computers. That was one of the first tests that were done in the 1960s when we actually look at the pioneers of computational styometry. They were actually running the text of Paul. And what we tend to see is that at least 4 of the texts are definitely Paul. And what we often get is that they are, in fact, 7 different letters that are really Pauline. The other ones are, off there. Now, has this really settled the debate? No, because styometry only gets you so far. And while styometry does tend to point us in this direction, we have a variety of other debates that are going on. Because when we look at styometry, this is something that is very important. We have other noise that can be entered into this. So genre is one of those noises that actually enter into this and really kind of cause us issues, because genre will often overpower authorship. We also have other things like themes. Sometimes we have whether or not it's a formal letter or a formal writing, or is this something between friends. We have information that's shared between groups. So if you have a group that you're talking to a lot, your language is going to change, as opposed to if you're only talking to them once, because you have a lot more introductionary type of ideas that you have to put forth. So there's a lot of noise that comes into all of this, and it raises a lot of questions about whether or not Paul wrote this, or is it something else. Styometry can get us part of the way there, but it doesn't get us all the way there. And that's what 60 years of study with styometry has really shown us. But honestly, if you really look through their book, Paul seems to be kind of a side subject. He's not the main focus. One of the big focuses is the book of Luke and whether or not it's attached to another text. So let's just kind of let Britt explain it just a little bit.
And it turns out that Luke looks like it was written in the 130s to 140s.
So now Britt claims that it looks as if Luke is written in the 2nd century. Now, how he comes to that conclusion, I'm not really sure. I think it's rather circular. But part of the issue that he will actually raise is that, well, it's a 2nd century because Marcion wrote a different gospel and Luke must be based on that. But that's not what styometry does. It can't tell you whether or not a book is ripped from another book, at least not in the way that they're trying to make it seem. So let's see more what they have to say on this subject.
We know that John looks like it was reliant, at least in part, on parts of Luke.
So as I said, Luke becomes a very important point with the writers of Christ Before Jesus. Now, as we see, they claim that John is actually using Luke. Now, that may be possible, but the whole reason that they're claiming that is because based on their idea that Luke is a 2nd century writing, that means that John must also be 2nd century. Now, is it certain that John used Luke? Well, no. The issue here is that it is a possibility, but it's also a possibility that John was using other sources that Luke had. Now, the reason we can't say for sure that John was actually using Luke is because we don't have direct evidence. We have some shared ideas, but that's it. We don't have word for word stretches within these 2 texts that line up. And that is one of the ways that we determine whether or not a work is using another work. We see a clear taking from that other work. That's how we know that Matthew and Luke used from Mark, because we can actually see Mark within these other texts. We don't see that with John. What we see are some similar stories. And to jump from there to the idea that John had to use Luke simply isn't supported. But what else do they have to say about these gospels?
Matthew seems to be in response to some aspects of this.
So their idea is that Matthew is responding to this Marcion text. But really, what is being responded to here? They don't really tell us. Now, if you look at their book, they do give some clues, but their understanding of these ideas simply is off. For one, they claim that Marcion wrote another text. Now, that in itself is true, but then they call this text the antithesis, or antitheses. That's not what Marcion named it. It was simply the Greek term for what he was doing. It was an antithesis, or really just arguments against what was being claimed of them. So it wasn't a name, it wasn't a formal name, it was simply what they were doing. Now, what we see here, what their claim really is that we see some ideas within Matthew that show up in this Marcion work. Now, their idea is that, well, Marcion had to have written this work first, and then Matthew is responding, but they don't show why that is true. That is simply an assumption. Now, most likely, based on just the title alone, that they are arguing against other ideas that are coming up, one would assume that if we see something in Matthew and also in this other work, that in fact Marcion is responding to Matthew, because that's how an antithesis works. The idea that Matthew is instead responding to this other work simply doesn't make sense, and they don't actually provide any evidence for this. So there is no reason to think that Matthew is responding to this other work. And if we actually just look at the scholarship on this subject, most scholars place Matthew before Luke. And the reason for that is just the way that these texts evolve. What we see here is that Matthew and Mark share some stories, and Luke also shares them, but then he switches them. So what this really tells us is that Luke probably comes a little bit later. Either way, when we look at all of this information, what we don't see is what Britt is saying. He simply provides no evidence for it, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense. But let's really get into this claim. How does Britt actually explain this?
Because the claim is that Marcion of Sinope wrote the first gospel, and that was his claim, and that later Christians added the first 3 or 4 chapters of Luke and the last chapter of Luke and other content in there.
So yes, Marcion is a figure within the 2nd century, and at that point he begins within the proto-Orthodox faith. Later on he has ideas that he kind of develops, and they become heretical. He has a variety of ideas that are viewed as heretical by other church fathers, and he's basically excommunicated. Now, one of the issues that we have with Marcion is that he is basically the first person to create a canon. And because of this, many people assume that we have these other canon lists that are basically in response to what Marcion does. So he does have somewhat of an impact on early Christianity. So what is Marcion's canon? Well, we have a few letters from Paul, as well as the Gospel of Luke. So why do we have the Gospel of Luke there? Well, probably because Marcion and many others attached Luke with Paul, that there was some connection there. Now, obviously, Britt and Matthew don't actually think that this gospel was Luke. They instead say that it was Evangelion, which really isn't a title of a book either. And this is one of the problems that they get into because they don't know Greek. Now, if we look at Evangelion, what it means is the gospel. It simply is the Greek term for the gospel, and this is what people called it. So when we look at other church fathers, when they're talking about Marcion, what they say is that Marcion has a gospel, that this is his gospel. They don't actually name the gospel, they're simply saying that this is the gospel that Marcion has. Now, the claim within these later church fathers is that what happens is that Marcion is actually taking away from the Gospel of Luke, that he's actually cutting parts out of it. Now, what Britt and Wingo want to do is they want to swap that around. They want to say that Marcion actually wrote this first gospel, and then it was added to later on by these other individuals. Do they have any evidence for that? No. There's absolutely no evidence for that, and it doesn't make a lot of historical sense. Now, the big problem here is that by the time that Marcion is actually publishing his work, that he's actually putting this out, he is deemed a heretic. So why in the world would actual church fathers, people of the Orthodox faith at that time, take what Marcion wrote and then add to it and claim that it's actually true when they've already deemed him a heretic? It just doesn't make a lot of sense if you actually think about it. Now, another issue is that when we actually look at Marcion's gospel or the reconstructions of it, because we don't have any actual text of it, When we look at the reconstructions of it, we see that, yes, it's basically Luke with some things removed. Now, the way that we actually reconstruct it is really taking out quotes from the church fathers. They will point at different things that they have issue with. Now, the problem here is that they're not saying everything that was in Marcion's gospel. They're only highlighting the issues that they have. So we don't really know what was in Marcion's gospel. Now, there's a couple of ways to get around this. Now, if you look at the reconstructions of Marcion's gospels, what often happens is that they'll actually take the gospel of Luke. They'll be like, okay, this doesn't seem to go against Marcion's view, so we'll also add it. It's some guesswork there. But in the end, there's a reason why most scholars say that Marcion took from Luke, because that is what history tells us. That's what all the actual data that we have tells us. And that is the most simple explanation for what we have here. Plus, it doesn't make sense for Orthodox individuals, people who are condemning Marcion as a heretic, to then go and take his heretical works and actually build upon them. We just don't see that throughout history. So this is one of the big arguments that they make, though, and this is kind of what they stake their entire argumentation around, is that Marcion was the first gospel. Now, they never actually prove this. They don't provide a lot of evidence for this, but it's something that they assume. And based on this, they'll make a lot of circular arguments. They'll make a lot of assumptions, because for them, the conclusion is already there. The data really is secondary. Okay, but let's be fair here. How do they actually defend this position? Well, let's let Britt actually say.
When we look at a chapter level, where we would be able to tell, did the same person write all of that text? And then that would make Irenaeus' claim true. And that would mean that the text was older than Marcion when it was published. And so it would date back prior to 144. Or is it actually the case where those first chapters were added by later Christians? And it turns out those first 3 or 4 chapters were added by later Christians.
So if we actually listen to what he's saying, what we realize is that there's an either or fallacy, and that doesn't actually need to be here. So what they're really saying is either someone else wrote the entire thing, or that Marcion wrote it and then cut out chapters. But that doesn't necessarily need to be true, because in fact, Marcion does not actually have to have written anything here. So one of the ideas that people have actually espoused is that maybe there was a proto-Luke, that we have this version of Luke that was basically what Marcion had, and that later on it was added to over time, or that as he was doing his research and writing the narrative, ended up adding these other sections to it. So that is another possibility, that what Marcion actually has is this proto-Lucan gospel. Now, that is something that you have to take seriously. You can't simply ignore that. And this is something that a number of scholars have actually put forth. This is actually one of the ideas that I really enjoyed earlier on in my life. Now, do I believe it today? I don't know, but we do know that there was other sources before that, so it's not out of the realm of possibilities. So now let's just assume for a moment that chapters 1 through 3 are in fact later additions, and that chapter 24 is also a later addition. This doesn't mean that Marcion had to have written this text, though. Again, we could actually say that, well, this text actually exists beforehand, and like we see in Mark, someone else added to this text. Now, the thing is, we don't actually have any text that missed these chapters. We don't have any evidence of these chapters missing. In our earliest attestations to the Gospel of Luke, to the mentions of Gospel of Luke, to anything about the Gospel of Luke, we don't have any evidence that, well, this was never there. We don't have any other tradition of this idea. So in order to make this argument, we just don't have any data to suggest what they are saying. Now, they will claim that styometric analysis will show this. The problem, again, is that you can't run it at chapter level. And when we actually look at chapters 1 through 3, we have a good reason why they wouldn't show up with the rest of the text if we're running it at chapter level. The reason for that is that, one, we're looking at a genealogy. So that's going to greatly shift the most frequent words. So yeah, you're not going to find that same exact thing anywhere else because you're looking at a genealogy. You're looking at the same words repeated over and over again. So that should tell you right away that, well, there's reason to acknowledge that, yeah, this is going to show up a little bit different because of the theme that's going on. More so, we have a different theme within the beginning of the story anyways. We have more of a mythological birth. It's not the same type of history that we'd see throughout the rest of the text. It's something a lot different, something that's built up in a lot different manner. We also have the introduction there that is going to switch some of the words. So when we just look at the first 3 chapters, when we look at the theme in there, when we look at the genre in there, when we look at just the fine details there, of course they're probably going to look a little bit different than the rest of the gospel. That just makes sense. And this really goes for the same with the end of the text, because we have a switch in theme once again. This is why you can't run these chapter level analysis, because within one single book, you're going to have these switches. And if, like I said, you're writing a genealogy, that's going to be a massive change in the word use that you're using. So no, we don't actually see that these 3 chapters or 4 chapters are being added later on. Even their styometric analysis doesn't show that. And if you actually want to see this, I have a link down below that goes over their analysis of this, and it shows why they're full of just nonsense here, that they don't even know how to read their graphs. So again, I just can't stress this enough. Marcion most likely did not write that book. There's no reason to assume that their narrative is correct because, one, they're starting off with a false dilemma. They're starting off with a logical fallacy, and they're not actually looking at what we have for data, what we have for the historical resources here. They're simply making something up that's based on the conclusion that they already have.
And that turns out to also line up with the Bar Kokhba revolt, which we can get in.
Okay, let's breathe. This is one of the worst arguments that they have, because what it shows us is not only do they know nothing about styometry, but they don't know anything about history. Now, one of the things that they try to show, and this is really dependent on their view that Luke has to be the first gospel, or actually Marcion's has to be the first gospel, because if Marcion's isn't the first gospel, this all falls away. So what they will try to show is that in Mark 13, and this is going to be based off of the idea that somehow Mark comes after Marcion's gospel, that Mark 13 is actually talking about the Bar Kokhba revolt. It is not in any way. There's more reason to think that it's dealing with 40 AD than it's dealing with 140 AD. There's just really no reason to assume that it has anything to do with the Bar Kokhba revolt. So they will go into this a little bit more, and we will too. But if you want a thorough discussion why Mark may be in 40 AD, I'll actually link down below an article that I wrote that actually talks about this and kind of talks about how no, none of this has to do with the Bar Kokhba revolt. But for now, I think it was just important to actually point out that one of their ideas is that somehow Marcion's gospel is talking about the Bar Kokhba revolt, and because they believe that Marcion is the first, it means that everyone else is talking about the Bar Kokhba revolt. But we'll see how that is complete and utter nonsense in just a little bit.
And we get into how Mark 13, that's actually very likely to be about the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 130.
Okay, I guess that sooner was a lot sooner than I thought. So let's actually talk about whether or not Mark 13 is talking about the Bar Kokhba revolt. Now, we can basically rule it out very quickly because if we look at Marcion's gospel, and again, we have to remember that this is what they claim is the first gospel. When we look at Marcion's gospel of their version of Mark 13, what it basically relates is that when Jerusalem is under siege, when the armies are surrounding it, that is when you know the desolation has occurred. Now, can this apply to the Bar Kokhba revolt? No, it cannot. Why can't it apply to the Bar Kokhba revolt? Well, because Jerusalem was in ruins. The temple is gone. There is nothing there. Jerusalem just isn't really occupied anymore. It's going to become a Roman colony in the future, but at this point, there's basically nothing. The armies of Rome never encircled Jerusalem during this time period. The only time that this actually happens is with the first Jewish revolt. And at that time, this prophecy that is being made makes a lot of sense. It's clearly pointing to the downfall of not only the temple, but about Jerusalem as a whole. So if Marcion's gospel is the first gospel, it's actually pointing us to the first century, to the fall of Jerusalem and the temple. So now the only way that you can actually get Mark to speak about the Bar Kokhba revolt is if you ignore their actual argument. So if Marcion's gospel is actually talking about the first Jewish war, there's no reason for us to suspect that Mark would be talking about something else, because Mark is coming after this and is relying on Marcion's gospel according to these authors. But we actually have more problem there. So if we actually look at Mark, what it actually talks about is the desolation of sacrilege. So this is actually referring back to something that happened in Daniel when we actually see a statue being erected in the temple, and that is the desolating sacrilege. So this is what Mark is actually throwing back to. And we know that because when we look at Matthew actually cites Daniel. He actually makes this very clear. So what we're truly looking at, what is being referenced, is this idea that something will be erected in the temple. Now, what we are told by these authors is that Hadrian ended up erecting a statue on the Temple Mount sometime around this, and this is what caused the Bar Kokhba revolt. But again, if we look at Marcion's gospel, well, that doesn't work. And if we actually look at history, we don't see that happening until after the fact. Hadrian doesn't actually put a statue there until later on, until they actually throw out all the Jews from Judea. So there is no way that this is actually talking about Hadrian setting up a statue, because, well, it just doesn't line up with history. Not to mention that by this time there is no temple, so you're not really desolating anything here, because again, there's no temple. You're not desolating the Temple Mount because there's no temple. So what this could refer to, and here we do have to take the scholarly view that Mark is the first gospel, is actually a crisis that happened in 40 AD. Now, what happened here is that Caligula was going to actually set up a statue in the temple. This is something that was being rumored. This was something that was really causing a fit there, that was causing a massive stir. And if you look at Philo and Josephus, who are talking about this, they also kind of link it back to this Maccabean revolt when you have this first crisis. So because of this, you do have a few scholars who actually point to this, people like James Crossley or Maurice Carey, who say that this is clear evidence that what Mark is talking about is the Caligula crisis in the 40s. Because in this instance, everything really kind of makes sense, because you actually do have this possible desolation of the temple, where someone's going to set up something within the temple. Now that never happens, but there is a clear worry here. And if Mark is writing before this, that makes sense to have a prediction here, because everything was pointing towards that. So now part of the reason that they're actually suggesting this is because this idea of this desolating sacrilege doesn't make a lot of sense when it comes to the first Jewish revolt. And the reason for that is that we don't actually see anything like that happening. Yes, we do see the temple being destroyed, but that really doesn't refer back to something that's said in Daniel. It's not really referring back to this desolation that is being talked about. More so, when we actually look at Mark, what he tells us is that not a single stone will stand upon another one when the temple is actually destroyed. But when we actually look at history, and we can even see this today, that's not true. There are still stones stacked on one another. Most famously, we actually have the Wailing Wall. So there are some reasons to actually attach this to Caligula's crisis back in the 40s. But either way, if we see the evolution of this going from Mark to Matthew to Luke, what we see in Luke, by the time that actually gets to Luke and Marcion here, what we see is a clear reference, not to the Bar Kokhba revolt, but to the first Jewish war. So Luke is clearly talking about this, and in fact, Marcion's gospel is saying the same exact thing. So yeah, I know that's a lot, but it's really just something that we have to go over, because this is one of the claims that they make time and time again, that the Bar Kokhba revolt is a center point in this history. But if we actually just look at all the facts, it clearly isn't a center point. It's not something that's even discussed. It has no bearing on anything that we're actually going over. Because regardless of how we say it, whether or not Mark is the first or Marcion is the first, we're talking about events that happened in the first century. And that is super clear, especially when we look at Marcion's gospel. Okay, so why does this late dating actually matter to them? Well, let's see what Britt has to say.
If you're not just looking at the first gospel story written 30 years or so, or 60 or so years after Jesus, you're looking at 100 plus years before you get the first written story about Jesus.
This is one of my least favorite arguments that anyone makes, because it just shows that they don't have an understanding of ancient history. So going a century before something is written down really isn't that amazing when we look at ancient history. And in fact, when we look at Alexander the Great, our best sources for him are centuries later. Now, that doesn't mean that he didn't exist, because we have other ways to show that he existed. We have stuff from his time period showing, that he existed, some aspects of him. But what it does tell us is that we can go centuries without actually getting solid sources. And without those sources, without these sources that are centuries later for Alexander the Great, we'd know almost nothing about him. So why isn't this a problem? Well, in the case of Alexander the Great, we do see that they're actually using other sources. They're using sources that we don't have anymore, that have been lost. We also know that they have a system of oral tradition. This is something that's very common in the ancient world. When we're looking at literacy rates during this time period, the height is around like 3%. We're not looking at a very literate society. So most information is being passed on orally. This is something that historians have long known. Now, because of this, we often don't get written sources for much later after the fact. And even then, often we don't actually get the sources that those sources were based off of. We have a lot of different writings that are simply lost. So when we look at the Jesus story, even if we assume that it's 100 years after the fact that we have these gospels appearing, that doesn't really show us much. That doesn't say a lot. And it's not even that surprising when we look at it from a historical perspective, because there's a number of things that could be going on here. One, we do have oral tradition. Yes, over that amount of time period, we do have to be a little bit more careful, because things can kind of be skewed over that time period. That doesn't mean that they are skewed. We have a variety of different studies that show that, in fact, when we look at oral tradition, it stays relatively stable, at least the gist of it. The details do get a little bit fuzzy, but the heart of it, the core of it, tends to stay rather stable. But then we also have other things. For instance, we have Josephus in the 1st century who writes about Jesus. Yes, they're going to argue that Josephus did not actually write about Jesus, and we'll deal with that when it comes up. But the fact is, the vast majority of scholars agree that Josephus did write about Jesus. The evidence points to Josephus writing about Jesus. There's really just no reason to deny that. But again, we'll come to that when it comes up. The other thing is that we could have sources that predate them. And in fact, we know this happens. How do we know this happens? Well, even if we take their view, what Luke tells us is that, hey, there's been all these other different stories that have been passed down over time. And what I'm trying to do, like so many other people have done, is just to write a very orderly account. Luke tells us that there's other sources that precede him. So we know that people have been writing before that point. We can't say for sure how early from that point they were writing, but we know that these aren't the first gospels, that there were writings before this. So there are a lot of reasons to assume that even if their theory is correct, that we don't get the first writing until 100 years later, we have a lot of reasons to assume that yes, there were things that were being recorded before that have simply been lost. That's ancient history. But if we actually look at this in a critical manner, we can say that Mark was definitely written in the 1st century. Now we know this. Even if we don't take that 40 date that I argued for before, we know that he's written in the 1st century because we have people alluding to him, to the Gospel of Mark, from the 1st century. In fact, one of the earliest attestations to Mark that we have is by Papias. Now, this reference from Papias comes most likely around the 1st decade of the 2nd century, but it tells us basically who wrote the Gospel of Mark. That Peter had an interpreter, his name was Mark, this individual never met Jesus, or knew anything about that. But this is who wrote Mark. So we know from the 1st decade of the 2nd century that Mark was already being spread around. So we can place that into the 1st century and there's no problem. Even at the latest, it still predates Marcion. So we're just getting closer and closer to the time of Jesus. So their arguments here simply don't make historical sense, and it just tells us that they don't really understand ancient history. And if you're going to talk about ancient history, you should know some of this background information.